Okay, let's dive in. We're tackling a really dynamic theater of World War II today, the North African Campaign.
Absolutely. A huge, sprawling conflict fought between 1940 and 1943.
Right, across these vast, incredibly harsh deserts in Libya, Egypt, Tunisia. It's quite a story.
It really is. Started as an Italian effort, then you get the whole legend of Rommel, the Desert Fox, and the German Afrika Corps.
And it all culminates in this massive Allied pincer movement. So this deep dive is for you, the listener, looking for a clear but also, gripping path through it all.
Exactly. We're aiming to cut through some of the myths and the sheer volume of information.
We'll trace it from those very first British raids back in 1940.
All the way to that huge Axis surrender in Tunisia in 43. We'll look at the key battles, the military movements, and importantly, that hidden intelligence war.
That intelligence aspect is fascinating, isn't it? How much it shaped things.
Fundamentally, it really decided a lot of the outcomes, sometimes in ways that weren't obvious at the time. Okay, so where do we start?
Let's begin right at the beginning. Summer of 1940. Section 1. The first Blitz and the Axis intervention. So, the fighting really kicks off June 11th, 1940. Primarily in that border region between Italian Libya and British-held Egypt. The Western Desert Campaign, they called it.
Right. Italy had just jumped into the war on Germany's side, declared war on June 10th.
But Mussolini, he complicated things almost immediately, didn't he?
He did. Politically, it seems he was keen to join for prestige, but he made this public statement.
The one about not wanting to drag others into the conflict.
Exactly. Specifically mentioning neighbors on land or on sea, which everyone understood meant Egypt. He wanted to keep Egypt out of it, initially at least.
Which must have put the brakes on any immediate, large-scale Italian offensive plans there.
It suggests a degree of caution, yeah. But the British forces on the ground, UK troops, Indian, Rhodesian units, they didn't wait for Italy to make the first big move.
No, they went straight on the offensive.
Yeah.
Small scale but aggressive. Raids into Libya almost instantly.
Like that capture of Fort Capuzzo, that was, June 14th?
Just 3 days in. The 11th Hussars, bit of support from the Royal Tank Regiment, quick border crossing, grab the fort.
A bit of a tactical slap for the Italians right out of the gate. It set a tone, really. Proactive British moves.
It took until September 1940 for the Italians to launch their first major push, didn't it? The 10th Army moving into Egypt.
That's right. They advanced maybe about 100 kilometers, something like that.
But then they halted at Sidi Barrani, still quite a way west of the main British defenses at Mersa Matruh.
Yeah, about 130 kilometers short. And the sources are really clear on this. It wasn't some grand strategic pause.
It was supplies, wasn't it?
Completely. Their logistics just couldn't handle it. Moving an army across that kind of terrain, the distances, it ground to a halt, crippling supply problems.
And that halt, that pause, it gave the British a crucial window, didn't it?
Absolutely. Time to regroup, reassess, and plan their own response, which turned out to be something much bigger than initially intended.
Which brings us to Operation Compass. Initially planned as just a limited counterattack.
That's the fascinating part. Launched in December 1940, it was only meant to be a 5-day raid. Just disrupt the Italian camps, which were quite dispersed.
They only committed about 36,000 men, a Commonwealth force.
Tiny, really, compared to the Italian numbers on paper. But the success was, it was completely unexpected in its scale.
Why did it work so well?
Speed, concentration of armor, and hitting the Italians where they were weakest, their poor positioning in those isolated camps. The British basically bypassed the strong points and hit the gaps.
And this limited raid just snowballed.
Massively. In 10 weeks, they didn't just disrupt the Italian 10th Army, they effectively destroyed it.
They took Bardia and the fortified port of Tobruk.
Which becomes incredibly important later, obviously.
And then the decisive moment at Beta Fam.
Beta Fam. Classic armored maneuver. The British 7th Armored Division. They made this incredibly bold dash right through the open desert, cutting off the main Italian retreat path along the coast.
Got there just ahead of the Italians, didn't they?
By about 90 minutes, according to the accounts. Set up a blocking position. The retreating Italians ran right into them, trapped between the block and the main Allied pursuit.
Annihilation, basically.
Pretty much the end of the 10th Army as an effective force. That move really sealed the deal for Operation Compass.
And the sheer scale of the Italian losses, it's still hard to grasp.
It really is. Over 130,000 Italian prisoners of war taken during that whole operation.
That's not just a defeat. It's a catastrophe for the Axis in North Africa.
Utterly. It exposed just how weak the Italian position was, and it forced Hitler and the German High Command to intervene directly. They couldn't afford to lose North Africa entirely.
Which leads us directly to 1.3, the arrival of the Afrika Corps. Mussolini had to ask for help.
He had no choice. So the Germans scrambled to put together this motorized expeditionary force, Operation Sonnenblume, Sunflower. This became the nucleus of the famous Afrika Corps.
And they put General Erwin Rommel in charge.
Yes, a commander already building a reputation from the campaign in France.
But it's crucial to stress, as the sources do, how limited this initial German commitment was.
Very limited. We picture the Afrika Corps as this huge German desert army, but initially, it was just one panzer division.
Later reinforced, but never more than 2 panzer divisions and 1 motorized division at its peak, right?
Correct. Hitler's focus was overwhelmingly on the upcoming invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. North Africa was seen as a sideshow, almost a distraction.
So the Germans expected Italy to still provide the bulk of the troops and, crucially, the supplies.
Absolutely. The German role was initially envisioned as purely defensive. Stiffen the Italian line, prevent a total collapse.
So Rommel's orders were explicit. Stabilize the front, hold the line, nothing more aggressive.
Crystal clear orders. Reinforce the Italians, dig in around Tripoli, maybe push forward slightly to a more defensible line, but absolutely no major offensives. That was the directive from Berlin.
But this is Rommel we're talking about, the Desert Fox.
Exactly. And what does Rommel do almost the moment his boots hit the sand?
He ignores his orders. Completely.
He makes his own assessment, sees the British are overstretched, maybe a bit complacent after Compass,
and decides his own tactical judgment is more important than the strategic caution from high command. Which takes us into the next phase. Rommel's arrival in February 41 really ignites the famous seesaw war in the desert. He lands, takes stock, and almost immediately he attacks.
He does. What starts as supposedly an armored reconnaissance out of El Agila in March 1941.
He just turns it into a full-blown offensive.
Yeah.
Completely unauthorized.
It's pure Rommel, and you have to connect it back to the Allied situation. Why was he so successful so quickly?
It wasn't just German brilliance, was it? It was Allied weakness, too.
A huge part of it. Those veteran British units, the ones who'd smashed the Italians in Operation Compass, they weren't there anymore.
They'd been shipped off to Greece, hadn't they?
Yeah.
A disastrous campaign there.
Exactly. A major strategic blunder, arguably. It left the forces holding the line in North Africa relatively inexperienced, maybe not fully equipped, and suddenly facing this fresh, highly motivated, brilliantly led German armored force.
So Rommel wasn't just maneuvering tanks well. He was exploiting a massive gap left by Allied strategic decisions.
Precisely. He saw the weakness and drove right through it. The speed was incredible. Allied forces were pushed back hundreds of miles.
Senior officers captured, units overrun. It was chaos for the Allies.
It led directly to one of the most famous episodes of the campaign, the Siege of Tobruk in 1941.
As Rommel's forces surged forward, the Australian 9th Infantry Division couldn't retreat fast enough, or chose not to, and fell back into the fortress port of Tobruk.
Right. Rommel bypassed it, pushed on deep towards the Egyptian border, reaching Salem and the strategically vital Halfaya Pass.
But this created a massive problem for him, didn't it?
A huge logistical headache. His spearheads were now way out at the end of a very, very long supply line stretching all the way back to Tripoli. Hundreds of miles.
And Tobruk, with its garrison, was sitting right astride that coastal supply route, a constant threat in his rear.
The sources are unanimous on this. Further advances into Egypt, towards the Suez Canal, were basically impossible as long as Tobruk held out. He needed that port.
Needed the harbor for supplies, fuel, water, ammunition closer to the front.
Absolutely critical, which is why holding Tobruk became such an Allied priority, and taking it became an obsession for Rommel.
This pressure leads us to 2.2, Allied counter-efforts. They had to try and relieve the siege.
They launched a couple of attempts fairly quickly. Operation Brevity was a small-scale affair, didn't achieve much.
Then the bigger one, Operation Battle Axe, in June 41.
Also a failure, costly for the British. It really showed that Rommel and the Afrika Corps had the tactical edge at this point. They were outthinking and outmaneuvering the British forces.
These failures led to heads rolling, didn't they? Big command shakeup.
Yes. General Archibald Wavell, who'd overseen Compass but also the disaster in Greece and now Battle Axe, was relieved.
Replaced by General Claude Auchinleck.
The Auchet. And it's under Auchinleck that the forces in the desert are formally reorganized and designated as the 8th Army.
And we should stress, this wasn't just a British army.
Not at all. It was a truly multinational force. Troops from Britain, yes, but also large contingents from Australia, India, New Zealand, South Africa. even Free French units fighting alongside them.
A massive commitment of Commonwealth and Allied resources to stop Rommel.
Definitely. And their big chance came later that year with Operation Crusader, launched in November 1941.
This was the major counteroffensive aimed squarely at relieving Tobruk and pushing Rommel back.
It was the first really big clash between the bulk of the Afrika Corps and the newly reorganized, reinforced 8th Army. A very complex, confusing battle, lots of back-and-forth fighting, tank battles swirling across the desert.
It's a real seesaw battle, as the sources describe
Yes,
it.
but eventually, after weeks of intense combat, the Axis forces, particularly the Italians holding key positions, were worn down and forced to withdraw.
So Tobruk was finally relieved.
Yes. The siege was lifted, and Rommel was pushed all the way back, westwards again, essentially returning the front line to where it had been before his offensive started, back near El Agila by January 1942.
So a cycle emerges, Axis blitz, Allied counterpunch pushes them back. It seems like the Allies had regained the initiative.
It looked that way. But Rommel was incredibly resilient, and perhaps underestimated by the Allies yet again.
He got supplies, reinforcements through Tripoli.
Quicker than the Allies anticipated, it seems. And here's where, as you said earlier, it gets really interesting. He doesn't wait to be attacked again.
No, he attacks first. Again. Spring 1942.
Which leads us to 2.3, the height of Axis success. This offensive, starting around May 1942, was perhaps Rommel's masterpiece.
The Battle of Gazala in June 1942.
A stunning Axis victory. Rommel used maneuver, deception, concentrated his armor brilliantly, completely outfoxed the 8th Army and their defensive boxes.
And crucially, this time, he captured Tobruk.
Yes. A huge blow to the Allies, not just strategically, but psychologically. And tens of thousands of prisoners taken too, over 30,000.
Capturing Tobruk finally gave him that secure forward supply base he desperately needed.
Exactly. It opened the door for that final dramatic push towards the Nile.
The Axis forces just drove the 8th Army relentlessly back right across the Egyptian border, deeper than they'd ever penetrated before.
An incredible advance. It really looked like the British position in the Middle East might collapse entirely.
How close did they get?
Agonizingly close for the Allies. The advance was only stopped, finally, just 90 miles, about 140 kilometers short of Alexandria.
At the First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942.
Right. A desperate, scrambling defense if Rommel had broken through there.
The Suez Canal, the path to the Middle Eastern oil fields, it would have been catastrophic.
Unthinkable consequences. The Mediterranean potentially becoming an Axis lake. So what stopped him? Why did the seemingly unstoppable advance finally run out of steam?
It wasn't necessarily superior Allied fighting at that specific moment, was it?
Not entirely. Auchinleck, who took direct command of the 8th Army himself in the crisis, conducted a skillful defense using the terrain bottleneck at El Alamein, nowhere to outflank. But the primary factor.
Logistics again.
Sheer exhaustion. Rommel's forces had outrun their supply lines again. They were short of fuel, ammunition, tanks, everything. They'd pushed themselves to the absolute limit.
So, tactical genius hits the wall of strategic reality. You can only advance as far as your fuel cans allow.
Precisely, a critical distinction. Which leads us perfectly into the next section, because those supply lines and the fight to control them were heavily influenced by a secret war.
Right, we often picture tanks blazing away, but the sources make it so clear that this unseen war, the intelligence war, was just as crucial, if not more so at times.
Absolutely fundamental. And for a key period, particularly leading up to and during that Gazala offensive, the Axis had a truly startling intelligence dominance.
What were they getting?
Well, they had success intercepting various Allied radio communications, but the single most damaging source, the jackpot for them, came from an Allied source itself.
Not cracking British codes.
No, something even more direct. They were reading the reports of Colonel Bonner-Fellers, the U.S. military attaché based in Cairo.
An American attaché.
Yeah.
How were the Germans and Italians reading his reports?
Fellers was sending incredibly detailed, candid reports back to Washington, and I mean detailed. British strengths, positions, their losses, planned reinforcements, supply levels, future plans, even assessments of morale, everything.
Basically, Rommel was getting the 8th Army's daily briefing notes.
Pretty much. It was an intelligence officer's dream. The reason was a catastrophic lapse in American cryptographic security.
What happened?
The Italians, specifically their military intelligence service, SIM, had managed to get access to the code room in the U.S. Embassy in Rome back in September 1941.
They broke in.
Or compromised someone. However they did it, they stole or photographed the code books for the black code used by the U.S. State Department and its military attachés.
And they cracked it.
They cracked it. So Feller's detailed reports, sent in the supposedly secure code, were being intercepted, decrypted almost in real time by the Italians, and passed straight to the Germans, straight to Rommel's desk.
Incredible. No wonder the Germans called Feller's die Gutke.
The good source. Between roughly January and June 1942, during that period of Rommel's greatest successes culminating in Gazala and the push to El Alamein, he knew virtually everything the British were planning, sometimes almost before the British field commanders did.
The tactical advantage must have been immense, knowing where the enemy is weak, where they plan to attack.
Devastating. And it wasn't just the strategic stuff from Feller's. Rommel also had his own excellent tactical intelligence unit.
The 621st Signals Battalion.
That's the one. They were masters at exploiting sloppy British radio procedures.
What kind of sloppiness?
British units, especially armored regiments, were apparently notorious for transmitting routine messages, even orders sometimes in clear, uncoded voice messages. Basic radio discipline was often poor.
So the Germans were just listening in.
Listening in, identifying units, tracking their movements, gauging their supply status, even getting a feel for their intentions just by the chatter. If Feller's provided the blueprint, the 621st provided the real-time tactical overlay.
A perfect storm of intelligence failure for the Allies and a massive advantage for the Axis. How did it end?
Abruptly. And ironically, during Rommel's victory at Gazala, there was an Allied counterattack, and in the confusion, the forward post of the 621st Signals Battalion was overrun.
And the Allies captured their logs and equipment.
Exactly. When Allied intelligence examined the captured documents, the penny dropped. They realized the extent of the Feller's leak, they found references confirming they were reading his reports, and they saw just how much tactical information the Germans were gleaning from poor radio security.
That must have sent shockwaves through Allied command.
You can imagine. It was a terrifying realization. The response was immediate and drastic.
What did they do? Shut Feller's down?
Yeah.
Change the code?
The code was changed. Eventually. But more immediately, the British imposed rigid radio silence on reserve formations, brought in much more sophisticated codes for frontline communication, and cracked down hard on discipline. No more casual chatter over the airwaves.
So that tap of easy tactical intelligence was turned off for Rommel.
Pretty much overnight. It blinded him tactically to a large extent, forcing him to rely much more on traditional and riskier reconnaissance. And the Feller's leak was plugged. A huge shift in the intelligence balance.
Meanwhile, the Allies had their own ace up their sleeve, didn't they? Ultra.
Yes. The ability to decrypt high-level German communications encoded using the Enigma machine. Ultra is often portrayed as the war-winning weapon.
But the sources suggest its impact in the desert, especially tactically, was maybe more nuanced.
Initially, yes. Ultra-intelligence wasn't always timely. Decoding and distributing it took time, so sometimes the information was out of date by the time it reached the commanders in the field.
And it could even be misleading.
Occasionally. The classic example is back when Rommel first arrived. Ultra-intercepts correctly told Wavell that Rommel's orders were strictly defensive.
So Wavell relaxed, thinking Rommel wouldn't attack.
Right. But Rommel, being Rommel, ignored his orders and attacked anyway. It showed the danger of relying solely on intercepted orders. You had to factor in the commander's personality and initiative.
And Rommel himself made it harder for Ultra, didn't he? By being secretive.
He did. He was apparently quite paranoid about security, especially regarding his Italian allies, who he suspected, sometimes rightly, of leaking information. So he often kept his detailed operational plans very close to his chest, not sharing them fully, even with Italian or sometimes German high command.
Which meant there was less detailed planning traffic for Ultra to intercept regarding his specific tactical moves.
Exactly. It unintentionally hampered Allied efforts to predict his next step using Enigma intercepts.
So if Ultra wasn't always the tactical silver bullet on the battlefield, where did it have its biggest impact in North Africa?
Supply lines, without a doubt. Strategically, Ultra was devastatingly effective against Axis shipping in the Mediterranean.
How so?
Because Ultra intercepts could often provide incredibly precise details. Which ships were sailing, when they were leaving port, what route they were taking, sometimes even what cargo they were carrying.
Gold dust for the Royal Navy submarines and the Royal Air Force based in Malta?
Absolutely. Malta, sitting right in the middle of the main supply routes from Italy to Tripoli and Benghazi, became an unsinkable aircraft carrier, guided by Ultra intelligence. They could position forces to intercept those convoys with remarkable accuracy.
And the impact on Axis supplies was massive.
Huge. The exact figures are debated by historians, as the sources note. Some estimates suggest that at critical periods, thanks largely to Ultra, between 40% and maybe even 60% of all Axis supply shipping heading for North Africa was being sunk.
40 to 60%. How can you sustain a war effort with losses like that?
It's incredibly difficult, bordering on impossible, for a prolonged, high-intensity campaign like the one in the desert, which was utterly dependent on fuel and mechanized equipment.
The sources also mention conflicting accounts, don't they? Some saying that despite Ultra, a huge amount of tonnage did get through.
Yes, and this is important for a balanced picture. Some figures suggest that out of about 2.67 million tons shipped, something like 2.24 million tons actually arrived in Africa.
That sounds like a much higher success rate for the Axis getting supplies through.
Yeah.
How do we square that circle?
Well, it suggests a few things. Maybe Axis convoy routing became much smarter, using faster ships, shorter routes, perhaps hugging the coast. Maybe Italian port handling was more efficient than credited. It implies that while Ultra gave the Allies the information to strike, actually sinking the ships wasn't always guaranteed. Weather, defenses, luck all played a part.
So Ultra wasn't a magic weapon that just stopped everything.
No, it didn't completely choke off Axis supplies, but what it did do was severely constrict the flow. It meant Rommel almost never had enough fuel, enough tanks, enough ammunition for sustained operations. He was constantly operating on a logistical shoestring.
It denied him reserves, denied him the ability to build up overwhelming strength.
Precisely. That 40–60% loss rate, even if not total, represented the margin between being able to launch deep offensives and just barely holding the line. In a war fought at the end of such long supply lines, that difference was ultimately fatal for the Axis cause in Africa.
Okay, so by late summer 1942, the Axis advance has stalled El Alamein. Rommel's forces are exhausted, his supply situation is critical thanks in part to Ultra, and his key intelligence advantage from Fellers is gone.
The tide is definitely turning, and the Allies are preparing to deliver the knockout blow. But first, another big change in Allied leadership.
Right. Churchill wasn't happy with the stalemate after First El Alamein. Auchinleck, despite successfully halting Rommel, was replaced.
Yes, General Harold Alexander takes over as the overall commander-in-chief, Middle East. A very different style, more collegiate perhaps.
And crucially, command of the 8th Army itself goes to Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery.
Monty, a pivotal figure. Methodical, perhaps cautious, but brilliant at preparation, building morale, and wielding the growing material superiority of the Allies. He immediately set about reinforcing the 8th Army, drilling them, building up overwhelming strength in tanks, guns, and air power.
Before Montgomery was ready to launch his big attack, Rommel tried one last time, didn't he? The Battle of Alam Halfa.
In late August-early September 42, a final attempt to break through the Alamein line before Allied strength became completely overwhelming. But Montgomery anticipated it, set a defensive trap, and repulsed the attack quite comfortably.
Rommel knew then it was likely over, didn't he? He was desperately short of fuel for that attack.
He knew the odds were lengthening dramatically. His intelligence was poor, Allied air power was dominant, and the sheer weight of Allied numbers and equipment was becoming crushing.
Then came the decisive blow, the Second Battle of El Alamein in late October 1942.
This was Montgomery's set-piece battle. Not a battle of maneuver like Rommel preferred, but a grinding battle of attrition. Crushing was the word Montgomery used.
Using that massive superiority in artillery and tanks to just pound the Axis defenses.
Exactly. Intense fighting for nearly 2 weeks. But the Italian infantry formations, holding much of the line, eventually crumbled under the pressure, and the German armor couldn't plug all the gaps.
A decisive defeat for the combined Italian-German Panzer Army Africa.
Absolutely. It broke the Axis front and forced that long, painful retreat westward, back across Libya. El Alamein was the turning point in the Desert War.
But the Allies weren't just hitting from the east. Almost simultaneously, they opened a second front in North Africa itself.
Operation Torch, launched in November 1942. Massive Anglo-American landings in French North Africa, Morocco, and Algeria, territories controlled by the Vichy French regime.
A huge strategic gamble. What were the main aims?
Several. Primarily to secure victory in North Africa by catching the remaining Axis forces in a pincer movement between Montgomery's 8th Army coming from the east and the Torch forces from the west.
And also to relieve pressure on the Soviets.
Yes, that was a major factor. Stalin had been demanding a second front in Europe for ages. While Torch wasn't an invasion of France, It did force Germany to divert significant resources troops, aircraft to the Mediterranean, away from the Eastern Front.
Including those transport planes needed at Stalingrad.
Critically, yes. Sources suggest over half the Luftwaffe's Ju-52 transport fleet, desperately needed to supply Paulus's 6th Army, trapped in Stalingrad, was diverted to ferry troops to Tunisia in response to Torch. A major strategic impact.
But landing in Vichy French territory? That was risky, wasn't it? They were officially neutral, but collaborated with Germany.
Extremely risky. Allied intelligence suggested some French commanders might be pro-Allied, but it was far from certain. And in the event, the landings faced very different receptions.
How so?
In Algiers, a local pro-Allied coup by French resistance fighters neutralized the Vichy command just before the landings, so resistance was minimal. But in Iran, and especially in Morocco, around Casablanca, the Vichy French forces fought back hard.
Bloody fighting against the Americans.
Yes, particularly around Casablanca. Strong naval and coastal defense resistance. It wasn't the easy walkover some had hoped for.
How was it resolved?
After about 3 days of fighting and some very tense, complex negotiations involving the senior Vichy commander in North Africa, Admiral François Darlan, and the American commanders like Mark Clark and Eisenhower, Darlan eventually agreed to order a ceasefire.
And Vichy forces in North Africa switched sides.
Essentially, yes. They ceased resistance and, over time, were integrated into the Allied war effort. A controversial deal at the time, dealing with Darlan, but it achieved the immediate military objective of ending the fighting.
So, with the Allies landing in the west and Montgomery pushing from the east, Tunisia becomes the final battleground.
Exactly. The Tunisian campaign, the Axis, reacted incredibly quickly to the Torch landings. They realized the danger immediately. Hitler ordered Tunisia to be held at all costs. German and Italian troops were rushed across the short sea gap from Sicily, often by air. They poured men and equipment in.
And they managed to stop the initial Allied push towards Tunis.
They did. The Allies, particularly the British First Army advancing from Algeria, made an initial dash for Tunis, but were undermanned and poorly coordinated. The Axis, benefiting from shorter supply lines and temporary air superiority, managed to establish a strong defensive bridgehead.
And the Allies, especially the newly arrived American forces, learned some hard lessons there, didn't they?
Painfully hard. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943.
What happened there?
It was the first major clash between American and experienced German troops, specifically Panzer units under Rommel. The Germans launched a successful offensive, exploiting American inexperience and poor command decisions.
Routing the U.S. Axis Corps.
Inflicting heavy casualties, capturing hundreds of tanks and vehicles, and pushing the Americans back significantly. It was a real shock to the U.S. system, a wake-up call.
But they learned quickly.
They did. Command changes were made, tactics were adjusted. Kasserine, while a defeat, ultimately helped forge the U.S. Army into a more effective fighting force.
By March 1943, though, the strategic picture for the Axis was grim. The pincers were closing.
Definitely. Montgomery's 8th Army, after an incredible pursuit across Libya, capturing Tripoli along the way, finally linked up with the Allied forces from Torch, now consolidated under General Alexander's 18th Army Group, which included the British First Army and the reorganized U.S. Second Corps.
The two-army pincer was complete. Rommel and the remaining Axis forces were trapped in northern Tunisia.
Compressed into a shrinking pocket, facing overwhelming Allied superiority in the air, on the sea, and on the ground. Rommel himself, ill and recognizing the hopelessness, left Africa for the last time in March.
Replaced by the Italian General Mess. But they still put up a fight, didn't they, using the Mareth Line?
Yes, the Mareth Line was a formidable pre-war French defensive line facing Libya. The Axis occupied it, hoping to halt Montgomery's 8th Army.
How did Montgomery overcome it? Frontal assault.
He initially tried, but it was costly. So typically for Montgomery, he planned meticulously and executed a difficult flanking maneuver, an outflanking huck through difficult terrain to the south and west, forcing the Axis to abandon the line after some very tough fighting.
While the First Army pushed from the west.
Exactly. The main Allied offensive began in mid-April. The Axis forces were outmaneuvered, outnumbered, starved of fuel and ammunition due to Allied air and sea power controlling the Mediterranean.
The collapse came quickly then.
Very quickly in the end. By early May, the Axis lines were breaking everywhere. Tunis and Bizerte fell. The remaining Axis forces were pushed into the Cape Bon Peninsula,
leading to the final surrender on May 13th, 1943.
A massive surrender. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers, 275,000 German and Italian personnel went into captivity. The sources note the 1st Italian Army under Messe was the last organized Axis force to lay down its arms.
An absolutely huge strategic victory for the Allies. Which brings us to the aftermath and reflection.
The human cost, first of all, was immense. Nearly 400,000 casualties on both sides killed, wounded, captured, died of disease over the 3 years.
And that final capture of 275,000 Axis troops. What was the strategic impact of losing so many experienced soldiers?
Catastrophic for the Axis war effort. These weren't raw recruits. Many were veterans of Poland, France, the early desert campaigns, or the Eastern Front. Losing them was a blow Germany and Italy could ill afford, especially with massive battles raging in Russia and the looming threat of invasion in southern Europe.
It directly led to the invasion of Sicily, didn't it? Cleared the path.
Absolutely. North Africa secured. The Allies had the springboard for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, in July 1943. And that invasion led directly to Mussolini's downfall and Italy's eventual exit from the war.
And it meant the end of Italy's colonial empire in Africa.
Completely. All their African colonies were lost.
One final point the sources raise is challenging that popular image of the Desert War as a war without hate.
Yes, that narrative of a chivalrous clash between Rommel and the Eighth Army, somehow cleaner than the fighting elsewhere. Modern scholarship, looking at the evidence, really disputes that.
Documented atrocities.
Yes. Against Allied prisoners of war, certainly, but also, significantly, abuses committed by both German and Italian forces against the local North African populations, Maghrebi Jews, Berbers, Arabs, things like forced labor theft, violence against civilians. It wasn't the clean war of legend.
An important corrective to the myth. So, pulling it all together, what's the big picture takeaway?
North Africa was this incredible theater of extremes, wasn't it? Huge distances, lightning advances, but always dominated by that brutal reality of logistics.
It showed that even tactical brilliance like Rommel's couldn't ultimately overcome strategic disadvantages in supply and intelligence, especially against a determined multinational Allied effort.
Exactly. The Allies eventually mastered the intelligence game with Ultra's impact on supply lines, and they brought overwhelming material force to bear. Determination and innovation could only take the Axis so far when the fuel ran out and the shells weren't there.
So connecting it to the wider war, that surrender in Tunisia wasn't just the end of a campaign, it was a major turning point.
Absolutely. It stripped the Axis of hundreds of thousands of veteran troops they desperately needed elsewhere, and it opened up southern Europe, the soft underbelly, as Churchill called it, for Allied invasion. It fundamentally shifted the strategic balance in the Mediterranean.
And that enduring legend of the Afrika Corps.
It's undeniable they fought with incredible skill and tenacity, often against the odds and in horrific conditions. But you have to ask, how much of their early success, the basis of the legend, was down to exploiting Allied disorganization, poor initial leadership, and those critical intelligence failures like the Fellers leak?
Versus inherent sustained superiority.
Right. The sources suggest their defeat wasn't necessarily being outfought man for man, but being strategically outmaneuvered, logistically strangled, and ultimately overwhelmed by Allied material power. Tactical brilliance met strategic reality.
A fascinating campaign, full of lessons.
Definitely. And it leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. Though the fighting ended there in Tunisia, think about the ripple effect of losing those 275,000 experienced Axis soldiers.
What impact do they have had elsewhere?
Exactly. Imagine those battle-hardened veterans defending Sicily or mainland Italy. Or, perhaps even more significantly, imagine them being transferred to the Eastern Front to face the Red Army in the titanic struggles of 1943 and 44. How might things have played out differently? Something to ponder.